The most dangerous man in Chicago was taking his fiancée home, until he saw his ex-lover crossing the street, physically struggling to carry two toddlers who bore the forbidden birthmarks of his own bloodline. Adrian Russo adjusted the platinum cufflinks on his bespoke tuxedo as his armored Maybach glided through the rain-slicked streets of downtown Chicago. Two black SUVs followed in a tight formation, his security detail, always watching, always lethal. The city lights blurred against the tinted windows, illuminating the woman beside him. Veronica Sinclair, 28, sat with her spine perfectly straight, her diamonds catching the light with every rhythmic tap of her manicured nails. She was everything his world demanded, ruthless, connected, and cold. At 35, Adrian had learned that in the syndicate, power was the only currency that mattered, and his engagement to Veronica was the ultimate transaction. It was a merger of two empires, 3 months in the making. No love, no passion, just business dressed as a wedding. "My father says the merger will make the Russo name untouchable," Veronica said, checking her reflection in a gold-plated compact. "Our wedding will be a coronation." Adrian said nothing. His steel blue eyes remained fixed on the road ahead. The traffic light turned red. The crosswalk filled with evening pedestrians, ordinary people living ordinary lives, unaware that the man watching them from behind bulletproof glass could end those lives with a single nod. Adrian watched them absently, his mind already calculating the next move against his rivals, when his heart suddenly hammered against his ribs. A woman was crossing the street. She moved with a desperate, heavy grace, her face pale and etched with an exhaustion that went bone deep. Even after 3 years of forced forgetting, Adrian knew that profile. Elena Wright, the woman he had abandoned to save her from his world. She wasn't pushing a stroller. She was carrying two toddlers in her arms, one balanced on each hip. She was struggling under their weight, her thin coat offering little protection against the biting wind as she hurried to reach the sidewalk. As she shifted the children to get a better grip, the boy's hood fell back. Adrian's breath hitched. There, stark against the child's pale neck, was the Russo crest, the dark, jagged birthmark that appeared only on his direct heirs. His eyes snapped to the little girl as she reached up to cling to Elena's neck. Her sleeve slid back, revealing the identical mark on her tiny wrist. Adrian's hands, which had never trembled while holding a weapon, shook violently against the leather armrest. The children looked nearly 3 years old. The timing was exact. "Adrian?" Veronica's voice cut through the silence, sharp and suspicious. "The light is green. Why are we still sitting here?" Adrian didn't hear her. He was watching Elena disappear into the crowd, her arms shaking from the weight of the two secrets that were about to burn his entire empire to the ground. The chandelier light in the Russo estate didn't glow. It glared, reflecting off the polished marble floors like sunlight on ice. Adrian Russo stood on the mezzanine, his hand tightening around a crystal tumbler of scotch until his knuckles turned as white as the lilies decorating the grand hall. Below him, 300 of the most dangerous people in the country toasted to his future, blissfully unaware that the man they called the king felt like a prisoner in his own palace. This engagement gala was a coronation of paper and blood. Beside him, Veronica Sinclair smoothed the silk of her emerald gown, her eyes scanning the crowd with the cold precision of a hawk. She didn't look for friends. She looked for vulnerabilities. "Smile, Adrian," she murmured, her voice a sharp blade wrapped in velvet. "The commission is watching. They need to see that the Russo and Sinclair lines are officially inseparable. Any sign of hesitation tonight will be seen as an opening for the Knox family." Adrian forced a tight, mirthless pull of his lips. He looked down at the crowd, but all he saw was the cage he had built for himself. Every alliance, every hit he had ordered, and every territory he had seized had led him to this moment, a life where his heartbeat was secondary to his ledger. He felt the weight of the Russo signet ring on his finger, a heavy piece of gold that felt like a brand. It was a symbol of a legacy that demanded everything and gave nothing back. "I've spent 15 years making sure no one can touch us, Veronica," Adrian said, his voice a low, dangerous growl that barely carried over the string quartet. "I didn't do it just to become a trophy on your father's mantle." Veronica turned, her diamond earrings catching the light as she tilted her head. You aren't a trophy, Adrian. You're the weapon, and I am the hand that guides it. That is the deal. She reached out, her fingers trailing over the lapel of his tuxedo. A gesture that looked like affection to the spectators below, but felt like a claim to him. The air in the room felt thin, poisoned by the scent of expensive cigars and the heavy, cloying perfume of socialites. He thought of the world outside these walls, the grit of the city, the rain, the raw reality of a life that wasn't choreographed by syndicate lawyers. He felt a sudden, inexplicable restlessness, a phantom itch beneath his skin. He had the crown. He had the empire. He had the woman the underworld envied. But as he looked into the dark, predatory eyes of his fiancée, Adrian Russo realized he was starving in the middle of a feast. He didn't know then that in less than 24 hours, a single red light and a pair of blue eyes from his past would tear the bars of this golden cage wide open, forcing him to choose between the power he had spent his life winning and the soul he thought he had lost. The heavy door of the Rolls-Royce didn't just close, it sealed out the world of silk and champagne, leaving Adrian in a silence that hummed with the sudden, frantic beat of his own heart. "Drive," he commanded, his voice a ghost of its usual authority. He ignored Veronica's indignant protests as the car pulled away from the gala's curb, trailing the worn, retreating figure he had glimpsed in the crosswalk. The rain had begun to fall in earnest now, a cold Chicago drizzle that blurred the neon signs of the city into bleeding smears of color. He kept his distance, the blacked-out Maybach creeping through the narrow, potholed streets of a neighborhood that his empire had long ago forgotten. This was the territory of the broken, where the streetlights flickered with a dying buzz and the air tasted of wet concrete and coal smoke. He watched through the glass as Elena shifted the weight of the two children in her arms. Her knees buckled slightly as she stepped over a puddle, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. She turned into the entrance of a pre-war walk-up that looked held together by rust and sheer will. Adrian stepped out of the car, his Italian leather shoes sinking into the grime of the sidewalk. He signaled his men to stay back, a silent order that brooked no argument. He followed her into the dim, yellow-lit hallway, the scent of boiled cabbage and damp wood hitting him like a physical blow. The wallpaper was peeling in long, jaundiced strips, and the heat hissed in the pipes with a sound like a dying animal. He watched from the shadows of the stairwell as she reached the third floor. She was fumbling with her keys, her breath coming in ragged, visible plumes. One of the toddlers began to cry, a thin, hungry sound that sliced through Adrian's chest. "Shh, Leo, we're almost home," she whispered, her voice cracking with a fatigue that made her look a decade older than the woman he had loved. She pushed the door open to a space no larger than his walk-in closet. The light she flicked on revealed a single room where a coat rack served as a wardrobe and a folded blanket on the floor passed for a play area. There were no diamonds here, no marble, only the stark reality of a woman who had been stripped of everything except the two lives she held against her heart. As she set the children down, the boy turned, the light from the bare bulb overhead catching the nape of his neck. The Russo mark burned there, dark and undeniable against his skin. Adrian leaned against the damp wall of the hallway, the realization hitting him with the force of a bullet. She wasn't just surviving, she was hiding in the heart of poverty to keep his bloodline invisible. He had built a throne on the lie that he had protected her by leaving, but as he stared at the cracked door of her world, he realized he had merely sentenced his own children to a life of shadows. The heavy silence of the hallway was broken only by the rhythmic, metallic ticking of a radiator that had long ago lost its battle against the cold. Adrian stood before the scarred wooden door, his shadow stretching long and jagged under the flicker of the hallway bulb. He didn't knock as a civilian would. He pushed the door open with the quiet, terrifying efficiency of a man used to taking whatever he wanted. Elena spun around, her heart visible in the frantic pulse at the hollow of her throat. She instinctively stepped in front of the two small chairs where the children sat, her hands clutching the back of the wood until her knuckles turned white. The space was so small that Adrian's presence seemed to swallow the oxygen, his expensive wool coat and the scent of luxury and gunpowder clashing violently with the smell of cheap soap and old dust. "Adrian," she breathed, the name sounding like a prayer and a curse all at once. Her eyes darted toward the children, a silent plea for them to remain invisible, though it was already too late. 3 years, Elena, Adrian said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register that vibrated in the cramped room. He didn't look at her. His gaze was locked on the boy, Leo, who was staring back with a defiance that was painfully familiar. You disappeared 3 years ago. I was told you left because you found someone else. I was told you were living a life of comfort in the suburbs. Elena let out a sharp, hysterical laugh that died quickly. Is this what comfort looks like to you, Adrian? Hiding in a place where the police don't come and the heaters don't work. I didn't leave because I wanted to. I left because your shadow was strangling me. Adrian moved then, a slow, predatory glide that forced her to step back. He reached out, his gloved hand tilting Leo's chin up. The boy didn't flinch. The movement exposed the nape of the child's neck, where the dark, swirling birthmark, the Russo crest, stood out like an accusation. Adrian's eyes then shifted to the girl, Ella, who was clutching a tattered stuffed rabbit. On her small wrist, the same blackened mark was visible beneath the frayed hem of her sweater. The mark doesn't lie, Adrian whispered, his voice cracking for the first time in a decade. But the timing, they aren't 3, are they? Elena's defensive posture crumbled, her shoulders dropping under a weight heavier than the children she had carried across the street. She looked at the toddlers, his living images, and then back at the man who had been the sun and the storm of her life. They're 4, Adrian, she confessed, the truth finally breaking the air between them. They were born exactly 9 months after that final night in the city, the night you told me we were over. They've spent every second of their lives in this room because it was the only place your world couldn't find them. Adrian stepped back as if he'd been struck. 4 years. He had spent 4 years building a fortress for a fiancée he despised, while his true legacy, the only blood that mattered, had been shivering in the dark, marked by a name they didn't even know they carried. The cage of his power hadn't just trapped him. It had orphaned his children while he was still alive. The ride back to the Russo estate was a descent into a cold, quiet fury that promised a reckoning. Adrian sat in the back of the Maybach, his eyes fixed on the rain-blurred city, but his mind was trapped in that cramped, freezing apartment. 4 years. His children had spent 4 years in the dark because of a lie he had swallowed whole. When the car pulled into the gravel drive of his fortress, he didn't wait for the door to be opened. He stormed through the grand foyer, ignoring the servants and the lingering scent of Veronica's expensive perfume, heading straight for the private study where his inner circle waited. Marcus Cole was standing by the fireplace, a glass of bourbon in his hand, looking every bit the loyal lieutenant he had been for a decade. He looked up, a practiced smile forming on his face. Adrian, you disappeared from your own gala. Veronica is... The sentence died as Adrian's hand closed around Marcus's throat, slamming him against the mahogany bookshelf with a force that sent leather-bound volumes tumbling to the floor. The glass shattered against the hearth, amber liquid hissing in the flames. I saw her, Marcus, Adrian hissed, his voice a low, vibrating growl of pure lethal intent. I saw Elena, and I saw the twins. Marcus's eyes widened, the mask of the loyal soldier slipping to reveal a jagged edge of panic. He struggled for breath, his hands clawing at Adrian's iron grip. I did it! For the syndicate! For you! He wheezed. Adrian's grip tightened. I sent letters. I sent money. I sent men to ensure she was safe after I broke her heart to keep Knox away from her. And you told me she had vanished. You told me she'd moved on with another man. She was a distraction, Marcus spat, finding a flicker of defiance as his face turned a bruised purple. You were becoming soft, Adrian. The merger with the Sinclairs was the only way to survive. If you knew she was pregnant, if you knew you had heirs, you never would have signed that contract. I saved your empire. You stole 4 years of my children's lives to protect a ledger, Adrian roared, throwing Marcus across the room. The lieutenant crashed into a side table, splintering the wood. Adrian didn't reach for his gun. He wanted Marcus to feel the weight of his hands. He stepped into the light, his shadow looming over the man he had trusted above all others. Every letter I wrote her, Marcus. Every cent I intended for her survival. Where are they? Marcus wiped a trail of blood from his lip, pointing a trembling finger toward the safe behind the desk. In the files. I kept them as leverage, just in case. Adrian didn't just feel betrayed. He felt foolish. The man who ruled Chicago had been played by his own shadow. He realized then that the enemies outside his walls were nothing compared to the rot within. "Get out," Adrian whispered, a sound more terrifying than a shout. "If I see you in this city after sunrise, I won't just kill you. I'll make sure the world forgets you ever had a name." As Marcus scrambled toward the door, Adrian turned to the safe, his heart heavy with the weight of 4 years of undelivered love. He had a war to win, but first he had to burn his old life to the ground. The scent of iron and ozone hung heavy over the daycare's colorful playground, a jagged contrast to the bright primary colors of the plastic slides. Adrian's car hadn't even fully stopped before he was out, his boots crunching over the glass of a shattered front window. The silent alarm had reached his phone 5 minutes ago, sent by the shadow guards he had secretly stationed in the perimeter, men who were now slumped motionless near the gate. Julian Knox didn't just send warnings, he carved them into the things his enemies cherished most. Inside, the usual chaos of a preschool had been replaced by a chilling, hollow silence. Adrian's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs, a sensation of pure, unadulterated terror he hadn't felt in all his years of warfare. He rounded the corner into the main play area, just as a gravelly voice echoed from the back room. "The boss wants the heirs, kid. Don't make this harder than it has to be." Adrian burst through the doorway, his weapon drawn, but the scene that greeted him froze the blood in his veins. 2 of Knox's soldiers were backed into a corner, one of them clutching a bleeding hand, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and confusion. In front of a trembling Ella stood Leo. The 4-year-old's small frame was rigid, his tiny fist balled at his sides, his face twisted into a mask of cold, predatory fury that was a perfect, terrifying mirror of Adrian's own. "Get away from my sister," Leo hissed. It wasn't the cry of a scared child. It was a low, vibrating command that carried the weight of a bloodline built on violence. As the second soldier reached out to grab him, Leo didn't scream. He lunged, his movements a blur of instinct, biting down on the man's wrist and driving a plastic toy with a sharp edge into the man's shin with a precision that was hauntingly tactical. Adrian moved like a hurricane, neutralizing the 2 men in a flurry of silver and lead before they could react to the child who had dared to fight back. He dropped to his knees, pulling both children into his arms, his tuxedo jacket stained with the dust of the scuffle. Ella was sobbing, but Leo remained stiff, his breathing heavy, his dark eyes fixed on the fallen men with a chilling lack of remorse. He looked up at Adrian, and for a fleeting second, the mark on the boy's neck seemed to pulse with a life of its own. "They tried to touch her, Papa," the boy whispered, the title hitting Adrian like a physical blow. Adrian pulled him closer, but a cold realization settled in his gut. Knox hadn't just attacked a daycare, he had triggered something dormant in the boy's blood. As Adrian looked at the carnage, he realized the war wasn't just about protecting his children anymore. It was about what they were becoming. And as he heard the distant sirens, he wondered if the darkness he had spent his life cultivating was already claimed by the boy in his arms. The grand ballroom of the Sinclair estate was a sea of shimmering silk and forced smiles, a gilded cage designed to celebrate a union that was now a lie. Adrian stood at the head of the banquet table, the weight of the twins' safety pressing against his chest like a leaden plate. Beside him, Veronica was radiant in white lace, holding a glass of vintage champagne high as she prepared to announce the wedding date. She looked like a queen, but to Adrian she was just another architect of the walls that had kept him from his children. "To the future of the Sinclair Russo empire," Veronica's father Silas boomed from the far end of the table, his eyes gleaming with the greed of a man who saw humans as assets. "A legacy that will never be broken." The room erupted in applause, but Adrian remained frozen. He felt the cold metal of his family signet ring, the same crest that marked his son's neck, and realized that every second he spent in this room was a second he was betraying the blood that actually mattered. He didn't wait for the cheers to die down. He stepped forward, the ice in his veins silencing the room more effectively than a gunshot. "There will be no wedding," Adrian said, his voice a low, jagged blade that sliced through the festive atmosphere. The silence that followed was absolute. Veronica's glass shattered against the marble floor, the champagne soaking into her white hem like a spreading wound. "Adrian," she whispered, her face contorting from shock to a murderous, trembling rage. "What kind of joke is this?" "The alliance is dead," Adrian continued, his gaze unwavering as he looked directly at Silas Sinclair. "I have found a legacy more valuable than your territory, one that I will not sacrifice for a contract." Silas stood slowly, the air around him darkening with the promise of war. "You realize what you're doing, Russo? You're not just breaking an engagement. You're signing a death warrant for every man under your command. The Sinclairs don't get cast aside." "Then start the clock," Adrian replied, reaching into his pocket and tossing the 5-carat diamond ring onto the table. It skittered across the wood, clinking against the silver before rolling to a stop. "Because from this moment on, anyone who stands between me and my family is just another target." He turned his back on the most powerful family in the city, the sound of his boots echoing like a drumbeat of war. He knew that by the time he reached his car, the Sinclairs would be on the phone with Julian Knox. He had just turned his only allies into his deadliest enemies, but as he stepped out into the cold night air, he felt a strange, terrifying sense of freedom. The crown was gone, but the father had finally arrived. He had no idea that Veronica was already reaching for a burner phone, her eyes fixed on a photo of Elena Wright. The war hadn't just begun, it had become personal. The safe house was a fortress of limestone and reinforced steel, hidden far from the neon glare of the city. Yet inside, Adrian Russo had never felt more vulnerable. The man who could negotiate million-dollar shipments without a tremor in his voice now stood paralyzed in the center of a soft-carpeted living room, holding a plastic juice box as if it were a live grenade. Elena was in the kitchen, her silhouette visible through the frosted glass, leaving Adrian alone with the two small enigmas who carried his blood. Leo sat on the floor, methodically clicking building blocks, together with a focused intensity that made Adrian's chest ache. It was the same look Adrian wore when stripping a handgun. Beside him, Ella was intently coloring a picture, her tongue poking out of the corner of her mouth. "Here," Adrian rasped, his voice sounding too loud, too jagged for the quiet room. He knelt, the expensive fabric of his trousers straining as he offered the juice to Leo. The boy looked up. His dark eyes, so much like Adrian's, didn't hold the hero worship of a child. They held a cautious, analytical weight. Leo didn't reach for the drink. Instead, he reached out and touched the heavy gold signet ring on Adrian's hand, his small thumb tracing the sharp edges of the Russo crest. "Does it hurt?" Leo asked quietly. Adrian blinked, confused. "The ring." "The mark," Leo whispered, touching his own neck. "The bad men wanted me because of the mark. Does it make you a bad man too?" The question was a bullet Adrian couldn't dodge. He looked at his son, then at Ella, who had stopped coloring to watch him with wide, expectant eyes. For the first time in his life, Adrian Russo was truly terrified. He wasn't afraid of Julian Knox's assassins or the Sinclair family's vengeance. He was terrified of the purity in front of him. He was a man of shadows trying to step into the light of a 4-year-old's scrutiny. He realized he didn't know how to play. He didn't know how to soothe a nightmare or explain why the world was a dangerous place. He was an architect of destruction trying to learn how to build a home. Gently, Adrian set the juice box down and sat cross-legged on the floor, a king abdicating his throne for a spot on a playmat. "It doesn't make you bad, Leo," Adrian said, his voice dropping to a soft, unfamiliar warmth. "It means you're a Russo, and being a Russo means I will never let anyone hurt you again." Ella crawled over, hesitantly resting her head against his shoulder. Adrian froze, his muscles tensing by instinct, before he slowly, awkwardly, wrapped an arm around her small frame. He was a monster in a fairy tale, realizing he wanted to stay in the story. But as he looked at the door, he knew the piece was a borrowed luxury. The mark made them his, but it also made them targets, and he still didn't know if he could be a father without teaching them how to bleed. The silence of the safe house was shattered not by a gunshot, but by the hollow chime of a burner phone left on the kitchen counter. Adrian reached for it, his heart plummeting as the screen flickered to life, displaying a grainy image of Leo and Ella. They weren't in their beds. They were huddled together in the back of a van, their eyes wide with a terror that no 4-year-old should ever know. Behind them, the shadows revealed the joined faces of his nightmares. Julian Knox, grinning with jagged malice, and Veronica Sinclair, her bridal elegance replaced by a mask of cold, vengeful fury. "The shipyard, Adrian," Julian's voice crackled through the speaker, smooth as silk and twice as deadly. "Come alone, no guards, no backup, and most importantly, no weapons. If we see a single Russo soldier, the heirs of the mark end here." The drive to the coast was a blur of rain and desperation. Adrian watched the city lights fade into the industrial gloom of the docks, the skeletal cranes looming over the water like hanging judges. He pulled his Maybach to a halt in front of Warehouse 14, the engine cutting out to leave only the sound of the rising tide. Slowly, with deliberate movements, Adrian stepped out of the car. He reached into his holster, pulling out the custom Beretta that had been his constant companion for a decade. He looked at the cold steel for a second, then dropped it onto the wet asphalt. He pulled a second blade from his boot and let it fall. He was a man stripped of his fangs, entering a den of wolves. The warehouse was a cathedral of rust. At the far end, illuminated by a single harsh spotlight, the twins were bound to 2 small chairs. Veronica stood over them, a silver pistol glinting in her hand, while Julian leaned against a crate, checking his watch. As Adrian stepped into the light, his hands raised and empty, the sound of his boots echoed like a funeral march. "Look at the king," Julian mocked, his voice echoing off the corrugated metal walls. "Walking into the lion's mouth without a single tooth. Is this what fatherhood does to a Russo? It makes you weak." "It doesn't make me weak, Julian," Adrian said, his voice a low, vibrating growl that made the soldiers in the shadows shift uncomfortably. He kept his eyes locked on Leo and Ella, seeing the way his son was trying to hold his sister's hand through the ropes. "It makes me focused. You want the empire? Take it. You want the shipments? They're yours, but the debt you think I owe you is paid in full the moment you let them walk." Veronica stepped forward, the barrel of her gun pressing into the hollow of Adrian's chest as he reached her. "The empire was never enough, Adrian," she hissed, her eyes burning with the humiliation of the broken engagement. "I want you to feel the weight of what you threw away." Adrian didn't flinch. He looked past her, catching Leo's gaze. The boy wasn't crying anymore. He was watching his father with a terrifying, silent understanding. Adrian knew he was walking into a trap with no exit, but as he felt the cold metal against his heart, he realized he had never been more powerful than he was in this moment of total surrender. He was no longer a boss protecting a territory. He was a shield protecting a soul. He braced himself for the flash of gunfire, praying only that his body would be enough to block the view of his children. The shadows of the shipyard finally receded, replaced by the amber glow of a setting sun over a quiet, secluded estate far from the blood-stained pavement of Chicago. The scars on Adrian's chest, earned during the desperate scramble where he had turned the tables on Julian Knox, were a permanent map of the price of his redemption. Julian was gone, his empire dismantled by the very chaos he had tried to weaponize. And Veronica had vanished into a self-imposed exile, her reputation as a syndicate queen shattered by the man who chose a worn-out coat over a diamond-encrusted life. Adrian stood on the sprawling back porch, a glass of water in his hand instead of the usual amber scotch. He watched as Leo and Ella sprinted across the tall grass, their laughter echoing against the tree line. There were no armored SUVs idling in the driveway, no earpieces humming with reports of encroaching rivals. For the first time in his life, the silence wasn't a warning, it was a gift. Elena stepped out beside him, sliding her hand into his. She didn't look tired anymore. The gaunt shadows beneath her eyes had been replaced by a quiet radiance, a peace that came from knowing she no longer had to carry the world alone. She leaned her head against his shoulder, watching as Leo paused to show Ella a discovery in the dirt. "He looks just like you when he concentrates," Elena whispered. Adrian watched his son, seeing the way the boy tilted his head as he examined a beetle. Leo's hood was down, and the Russo crest on his neck was visible. catching the fading light. For centuries, that mark had been a target, a symbol of a bloodline that took what it wanted and destroyed what it couldn't own. But as Adrian watched his son gently let the insect crawl onto a leaf instead of crushing it, he realized the curse had been broken. He had officially retired from the front lines, handing the remnants of his syndicate to those who still hungered for the throne, keeping only enough resources to ensure his family would never want for anything. He was no longer the king of Chicago. He was a man who knew the names of his children's stuffed animals and the exact way Elena liked her coffee in the morning. The mark no longer meant they were heirs to a criminal throne. To Adrian, it had become a seal of protection, a reminder that they had survived the storm and come out as something new. As the children ran toward him, shouting for him to come and see their find, Adrian realized that real power didn't live in the fear he could instill in his enemies. It lived in the trust of the two small humans who now saw him as their world. He walked down the steps into the grass, leaving the shadows of the Mafia boss behind, finally stepping into the light of the father he was born to be.